I didn't cry at my own wedding. I thought about that afterward, sitting in the back of a car that wasn't mine, wearing a dress that someone else had chosen, riding through streets I didn't recognize. And I couldn't decide if that made me strong or just completely hollow. The ceremony had lasted 11 minutes. I'd counted. 11 minutes to sign my name next to his, to listen to words spoken by a judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, to become, legally and irrevocably, Madison Shin. Madison Shin. Even now the name felt like a coat that belonged to someone taller. Gunwoo hadn't looked at me once. Not when I walked into that room, not when the judge asked us to face each other, not when I slid the ring onto my own finger, because no one had told me what the protocol was, and his hands had simply remained at his sides. He'd looked straight ahead the entire time, jaw set, expression carved from something colder than stone. And when it was done, he'd turned and walked out first, and his men had parted around him like water splits around a blade. That was 6 weeks ago. I lived in his house now. That was the most accurate way to say it. His house, in every possible sense. A property in Riverside Heights that sat behind iron gates and mature oak trees, the kind of home that looked, from the outside, like old family money and good taste. Inside, it was immaculate, sparse. Every surface clean and purposeful. The kind of space that had been designed to reveal nothing. There was a wing for me. An actual wing. A bedroom with its own sitting area, a bathroom with heated floors, a small room I'd been told I could use however I wanted. A woman named Jisoo came every morning to ask if I needed anything, and every morning I asked for coffee and said no. Everything was fine. Thank you. She never quite smiled. She never quite didn't. I had not seen Gunwoo since the wedding. Or rather, I had seen him. Twice. At a distance in the main corridor downstairs, moving between rooms with that particular kind of focus that made everyone around him go quiet. Both times he hadn't turned in my direction. Both times I'd stood very still, some animal instinct telling me not to draw attention, and waited until he was gone before I exhaled. My mother had done this. I kept coming back to that. She had handed me to this arrangement with both hands, smiling, talking about stability and necessity and the reality of what our family owed. She'd said Gunwoo Shin is not a man who makes idle offers, like that was supposed to comfort me. Like the weight of his name was a gift. What she hadn't said, what no one had said out loud, was that he'd chosen me specifically because of what her family had done to his. Because my mother's brother had stolen something from the Shin organization years ago, money or leverage or both, and had vanished before it could be repaid. And because my mother, left holding the debt, had offered the only thing she thought might satisfy a man like Gunwoo Shin. Me. Not as a partner, as a statement, as proof that the debt was acknowledged. I understood that. I'd had 6 weeks to understand it very thoroughly. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I'd been sitting at the small desk in my room trying to write a grocery list, of all things, something ordinary, something that made the days feel like they had shape. And Jisoo knocked and handed me an envelope without a word. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. The envelope had already been opened. Of course it had. I pulled out the single page inside and read it twice before the words fully assembled themselves into meaning. It was from my best friend, Camille. We'd known each other since junior year of college, the kind of friendship built in cramped apartments and bad decisions, and long phone calls that went until 2 a.m. After the wedding, I'd tried to reach her. She hadn't responded. I'd told myself she was busy, that she didn't know what to say, that silence wasn't rejection. The letter told me otherwise. She'd been approached. That was the polite word she used. Approached, by people who hadn't introduced themselves, but who had made it very clear that my friendships, going forward, would be limited, monitored, that any contact should go through official channels, whatever that meant. She was scared. She said she missed me. She said she was sorry she hadn't been brave enough to say this to my face, but she needed me to know that she thought about me, and that she hoped I was okay, and that she was, carefully, stepping back, because she had a mother and a little brother, and she couldn't afford to find out what stepping forward would cost her. She signed it with love, and then crossed those words out and wrote always instead, and that small correction, that moment of hesitation preserved in ink, broke something open in my chest that I hadn't known was still sealed. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time. Then I folded it, put it in the desk drawer, went into the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists the way my grandmother used to tell me to when I was upset, and stood there until the feeling in my throat loosened enough that I could breathe without it shaking. I was so angry I couldn't locate the edges of it. I found Gunwoo's office on the ground floor by accident. I'd been walking, just walking, moving through the house because staying still felt suddenly unbearable. And I'd turned down a hallway I hadn't used before and found myself in front of a closed door with 2 men stationed on either side of it. They looked at me the way people look at something unexpected. Not threatening, exactly, but assessing. "I need to speak with him," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. One of the men, tall, broad, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, looked at me for a moment, and then knocked twice on the door. A pause. Then a single word from inside that I didn't catch, but that was apparently sufficient, because the man opened the door and stepped aside. I walked in. The office was large and uncluttered. A desk near the far window, bookshelves along one wall, 2 chairs that looked like they'd never been sat in. Gunwoo was standing behind the desk, not seated, standing, looking at something on the surface in front of him, and he didn't look up immediately when I entered. He let a full 5 seconds pass before he raised his eyes. Up close, he was different than I'd processed from a distance. I'd catalogued him in fragments, the line of his jaw, the tattoos climbing his neck above the collar of his shirt, the way he occupied space like he'd measured it first. But standing in his office with the door closed behind me, he was simply a man. A man who was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, patient in the way that powerful things are patient, because they know nothing will move without their permission. "Madison," he said. Just my name. Like he was confirming something. "My mail is being opened," I said. He didn't respond, which I was learning was its own kind of response. A letter came for me today, from a friend. It had already been read before it reached me. I kept my hands flat at my sides because they wanted to fold together, and I refused to stand in front of him looking like I was bracing for impact. "She's frightened. Someone spoke to her, on your behalf, I assume, and told her to keep her distance from me. She's not a threat to you. She's not connected to any of this. She's just—" I stopped, steadied. "She's just someone who cared about me." Past tense. I hadn't meant to say it that way. Something shifted in his face. Almost nothing. A small tightening around the eyes. A change in the quality of his attention. He looked at me like he was seeing something he hadn't anticipated, and I couldn't tell if that was good or catastrophically bad. "Sit down," he said quietly. "I'd rather stand." Another silence. Longer this time. He picked up a pen from the desk, turned it once in his fingers, set it down again. "The letters are checked for security reasons, not to surveil you. The outcome is the same." He didn't argue that, which surprised me. "The conversation with your friend," he said, "was not my instruction." I stared at him. "Then whose?" He didn't answer, and the way he didn't answer told me that someone in his organization had moved without his direct authorization, and that he was, beneath that perfectly controlled exterior, not pleased about it. It was the first crack I'd seen in the surface of this world. The first suggestion that things happened here that even Gunwoo Shin didn't fully control. "I'll look into it," he said. "That's not enough," I said. and my voice came out louder than I'd planned, tighter, carrying 6 weeks of silence in it. She crossed out with love in her letter because she was afraid to write it. She's been my friend for 7 years, and she's afraid to tell me she loves me because of what your people might do about it. My throat was tight again. I hated that. I'm not asking you to dismantle your security protocols. I'm asking you to let one person in the world speak to me without fearing for her family. He was very still. The room was very still. Outside the window, somewhere distant, a car moved down the street. Normal, ordinary, completely unrelated to any of this. "I'll take care of it," he said. And something in the way he said it was different from the first time. Not a deflection, not a dismissal. Something more deliberate. I didn't thank him. I turned and walked to the door, and my hand was on the handle when he spoke again. "Madison." I stopped, didn't turn. The letter will not happen again. I left without answering, walked back down the hallway, past the 2 men who watched me without expression, back to my wing, back to my room. I sat down on the edge of the bed and realized my hands were trembling. Not from fear, I thought. From something more complicated than fear. From the small and dangerous awareness that in his office, for just a few minutes, he had actually listened. And I had no idea what to do with that. The thing about silence is that it has texture. I'd never thought about that before. Before this house, before these walls, before 6 weeks of learning to exist in a space that wasn't mine. Some silences are soft, the kind that settle around you on a Sunday morning when there's nowhere to be. Others are thin and stretched, like skin pulled too tight over something that wants to break through. The silence in Gunwoo's house was neither of those things. It was deliberate, architectural, built the same way the rooms were built, with precision, with intention, with the understanding that nothing here happened without a reason. I spent the 3 days after our conversation in his office waiting for something to change. I didn't know what. Exactly. A word from Jisoo. A note. Some indication that what he'd said meant anything concrete. Nothing came. The house continued its rhythm. Quiet mornings, the distant sound of movement in other parts of the building, cars arriving and leaving through the iron gates below my window. Gunwoo's presence somewhere in those walls, invisible but constant, like a current running beneath still water. On the 4th day, Camille called me. I was in the sitting area of my room, attempting to read, when my phone lit up with her name. I stared at it for 1 full ring before I answered, certain somehow that picking up would break the moment, that it was a test or a mistake or something that would disappear if I moved too quickly. "Hello?" My voice came out small. "Maddie." Hers came out like relief. "Oh my God, Maddie." We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. I know because I watched the timer on the screen the entire time. Some part of me convinced it would cut off, that someone would intervene. No one did. Camille told me about her job, her brother's new apartment, a horrible first date she'd been on with someone she'd met through her cousin. Normal things. Wonderful, mundane, irreplaceable things. At some point I started crying and didn't tell her. Just wiped my face with my sleeve and laughed at the right moments and let her voice fill up the room until it felt, briefly, like the walls belonged to me. When we hung up, I sat very still for a moment. Then I thought, he did that. Quietly, without announcement, without asking for acknowledgement. He'd made 1 call, or said 1 word to someone, and Camille had been able to reach me. It was a small thing. I knew it was a small thing in the context of everything this situation was. But it sat in my chest differently than I expected, heavier and warmer than resentment, and I didn't have a clean category to put it in. I started going downstairs. Not with any plan. I wasn't that composed about it. It started because my room, for all its comfort, had begun to feel like a very elegant holding cell. And there was a library on the 2nd floor that I'd glimpsed once through an open door, Books I actually recognized on those shelves. The kind that suggested someone in this house had tastes that went beyond furniture catalogs and intimidation. I started spending mornings in there. Just reading, mostly. Sometimes sitting by the window that looked out over the back garden, watching the light move across the lawn. Jisoo brought coffee without being asked after the third day, which meant she'd noticed, which meant someone had told her, which meant... I stopped following that thread because it went somewhere I wasn't ready to examine. It was in the library that I saw him again. Not the distant hallway version. Close. He came in without knocking. It wasn't his habit to knock in his own house, I was learning. And stopped when he saw me. Just briefly. A half-second pause that he covered immediately, crossing to the desk in the corner where a laptop was already open. He sat down. Said nothing. I looked back at my book. The room was very quiet. His fingers moved on the keyboard, occasional and unhurried. Outside, wind moved through the garden. I turned a page I hadn't fully read and told myself I was absolutely fine. "You read Didion," he said. I looked up. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were on the screen in front of him. "Yes," I said. "Which one?" I turned the cover slightly so he could see it, then realized he still wasn't looking. "The Year of Magical Thinking." A pause. Heavy choice for a Tuesday morning. "I didn't know it was still Tuesday," I said, and something in my voice must have sounded almost like dry humor, because the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but adjacent to one. Something that acknowledged the joke without fully committing to it. He went back to his screen. I went back to my book. We stayed like that for nearly an hour. I wish I could say I wasn't affected by it. That I maintained perfect, sensible clarity about who he was and what this arrangement was, and why warmth in his direction would be both irrational and dangerous. I had the logic. I could recite it to myself in order. But logic has never been particularly useful against the specific feeling of sitting in a quiet room with someone and realizing, with great inconvenience, that their presence is not unpleasant. He came back to the library the next morning, and the morning after that. He didn't always speak. Sometimes he just worked, and I just read, and the room did what rooms do when two people are in them long enough. It softened slightly, lost some of its formality, became shared space instead of his space that I happened to be occupying. I noticed things. The way he took his coffee. Black, no sugar. Always from a mug and never a cup. The way he read physical documents by holding them at a slight angle, tilting the page toward the window light. The way he went completely motionless when he was concentrating on something. Not tense, just stilled. Like a pause between heartbeats drawn out to its full length. On the 5th morning, he asked me if I needed anything. Not Jisoo. Him. Looking up from whatever he was reading, asking the question with the same tone he might use for something operational, something to be resolved and filed away. "I'm fine," I said. Automatic. He looked at me for a moment. "You said that when I asked about Camille, too." I blinked. "You didn't ask about Camille. I came to you." "Before that," Jisoo asked, on my behalf. I stared at him. The idea that he'd been checking in some indirect way before I'd ever walked into his office rearranged something in my understanding of the past weeks. I wasn't sure I liked what it suggested. I wasn't sure I disliked it either. "I needed to be able to talk to my friend," I said carefully. That was what I needed. And now? The question was simple. Genuine, I thought. Which made it harder to answer, because I was used to managing this house by making myself small and my needs minimal, and genuine questions had a way of finding the things I'd compressed down and pressing on them unexpectedly. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. He nodded. like that was an acceptable answer. Like he understood the particular difficulty of identifying what you need when you've spent long enough pretending you don't need anything. It was Jisoo who told me about the gala, and she told me the way people in this house delivered most information, briefly, factually, with the implication that the conversation was informational rather than negotiable. There was a charitable event, a fundraiser at the Harlow Hotel downtown, the kind of thing that filled rooms with people who had too much money and liked to be seen spending it well. Gunwoo attended every year. It was, Jisoo explained with careful neutrality, important for appearances. And this year, his wife would accompany him. I sat with that word for a moment. Wife. It still arrived in my chest like something foreign, like a word in a language I was studying but hadn't yet begun to dream in. When? I asked. Saturday, she said. A car will come at 7. Someone will bring dress options tomorrow morning. She left before I could ask anything else. I stood in my room and looked out the window at the garden below and thought about walking into a room full of strangers as Gunwoo Shin's wife. About standing beside him while people watched, catalogued, decided what I meant. About what it would feel like to be on his arm in public. Visible, present, chosen, even if the choosing had been a transaction. About whether he would look at me. I pressed my palm flat against the window glass. Cold against my skin, then slowly warming. Saturday, I thought. 3 days to figure out how to stand in a room and make it look like I belonged there. The dress they sent was a deep burgundy, fitted with a neckline that felt like a statement. I tried it on alone in my room, and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at me didn't look like someone's debt payment. She didn't look hollow. She looked, uncomfortably, like someone who was beginning to take up space. I wasn't sure yet if that was a good thing. But I put the dress back on its hanger and set it carefully on the door hook. And for the first time in 6 weeks, I fell asleep before midnight. The Harlow Hotel existed in that particular register of luxury that doesn't announce itself. No gold lettering over the entrance, no ostentatious chandeliers visible from the street. Just a building that was older and quieter than everything around it, with a doorman who moved like he'd been trained not to make guests feel watched while watching them completely. The kind of place where the carpets absorbed sound, and the air smelled faintly of something that cost more than I made in a month at my old job. White flowers, cedar wood, something underneath that I couldn't name. I'd worked in hotel hospitality for 3 years before the marriage. Mid-range properties, nothing like this, but enough to know the architecture of service. Enough to recognize, the moment we stepped inside, that every person in that lobby had been briefed on who was arriving. They looked at Gunwoo the way people look at weather. Not at him directly, sideways, carefully, with the awareness that looking too long or not long enough both carried consequences. He walked like he already owned the floor beneath him. I walked beside him and tried to remember how to breathe. He hadn't said anything when I came downstairs. I'd stood at the bottom of the staircase in the burgundy dress with my hair pinned back and my hands folded in front of me, and Gunwoo had been standing near the door in a black suit that fit him like it had been constructed specifically for the architecture of his shoulders, and he'd looked at me. Actually, looked. Not the sideways, past-me glances from the corridor. Not the careful non-acknowledgement of the library. He'd looked at me directly, fully, for long enough that the silence took on weight. Then he'd said, "Ready?" and turned toward the door. But something had changed in the few seconds of that look. I felt it without being able to explain it. Like a room where the temperature has shifted slightly, where you can't point to the source but your skin knows. In the car, he sat beside me. Not pressed against the door, not as far as the space allowed. Just beside me, at a proximity that felt different from the vast distances of the past 6 weeks. His hands rested on his knees. Outside the window, Manhattan moved past in its nighttime version, all lit glass and headlights, and people who had no idea that this car existed or what it carried. "There will be people tonight who want information," he said, looking forward. "Information about what?" "About you. About us." A pause. "About whether this arrangement has weaknesses." I looked at his profile, the clean line of his jaw, the tattoos rising above his collar into the open air of his neck, intricate and dark. "And does it?" He turned then, and I was close enough that turning meant he was looking at me from almost no distance at all. "Not that I intend to show them," he said. I held his gaze for a moment that lasted exactly as long as I could manage before I looked away. The gala occupied the entire third floor of the Harlow, 3 connected rooms with the walls folded back to make one long, breathing space, filled with the kind of crowd that dressed for significance. I recognized the shape of the event immediately. The careful clustering, the way certain people radiated their own gravity and others orbited, the drinks that were carried but not always consumed, the laughter that was social performance rather than actual amusement. What I hadn't fully anticipated was what it felt like to move through it beside Gunwoo. The crowd didn't part dramatically. It wasn't that theatrical. But there was a reorganization, subtle, instinctive, as people registered his presence. Conversations adjusted their angles. Eyes moved, and then were carefully redirected. The energy of the room rerouted itself slightly around him, the way water reroutes around stone, and I was close enough to him that I moved in the same channel. A man approached us within 10 minutes. 50s, silver-haired, the specific smile of someone who has rehearsed warmth until it became load-bearing. He shook Gunwoo's hand and said something in Korean that I didn't catch, and then switched to English when his eyes moved to me. And this must be Madison. He said my name like he'd studied it in advance. What a pleasure. "Thank you," I said, steady, polished. 3 years of hospitality work had given me this at least, the ability to stand in front of strangers and seem present even when I was running calculations behind my eyes. "We've heard so much," the man said, and left it there, hanging, in the way that people do when they want you to wonder what so much means. Gunwoo's hand touched the small of my back. Just his fingertips. Barely pressure. The lightest possible contact, the kind that could be accidental if you wanted to read it that way. But it wasn't accidental. I knew it wasn't accidental because it happened exactly when the man let that sentence dangle, and the touch said, without any words at all, "I'm here. Don't let him make you smaller." I kept my expression even. I smiled at the silver-haired man and said that we were happy to be here, and the conversation moved on, and Gunwoo's hand dropped away from my back. But the warmth of it stayed. A small, traitorous warmth that I filed away to examine later, in private, when I could afford to be confused. We separated briefly around 9. He was pulled into a corner conversation that had the texture of something professional, something I wasn't meant to be part of. And I found myself standing near one of the high windows that looked over the city, champagne glass in hand, doing the careful calculus of how to exist at a party alone, without looking like you feel alone. A woman appeared beside me, early 40s, sharp-edged in a way that suggested she'd constructed her edges deliberately. She had the kind of beauty that comes from knowing exactly what to emphasize and refusing to apologize for any of it. "You're braver than I expected," she said, looking out the window. I kept my eyes forward. "I'm sorry?" "Coming here, standing in this room." She sipped her drink. "Most people in your position would have found an excuse not to." "What position is that?" She smiled without looking at me. New, uncertain, trying to read a room that has been reading you for weeks. She paused. "My name is Yuna. I've known Gunwoo since he was 22. I looked at her then, properly. She met my eyes with the calm of someone who is rarely surprised. "You're testing me," I said, I'm observing you, she corrected. There's a difference. Testing implies I already know the answer I want. She turned slightly toward me. He hasn't brought anyone here before, not once in all the years he's attended this event. I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything with it. He needed a wife present. I'm his wife. He could have said you were unwell. He could have come alone, as he always has. Yuna looked back out the window. He chose not to. The city below us moved its ordinary, enormous life. Cabs and pedestrians and lit windows stacked 40 stories into the sky. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because someone should. She said it simply, without drama. People in his world don't give information freely. They use it. I'm choosing to give you some, because you look like a woman who knows how to use what she's given. She finished her drink, set the glass on a passing tray, and excused herself with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has said exactly what they came to say. I found Gunwoo again across the room. He was standing with 2 men, listening rather than speaking. That particular stillness of his that I was beginning to be able to read, not passive, not absent, but fully engaged in a way that didn't require external evidence. His eyes moved through the room at measured intervals. When they landed on me, they stopped. He excused himself from the conversation, crossed the room toward me, not quickly, not with any urgency, but directly. Like there was a single point of interest in the space, and he'd decided to move toward it. You spoke with Yuna, he said when he reached me. She spoke to me, I said. There's a difference. Something in his expression shifted. Almost humor. Almost. She likes you. She doesn't know me. Yuna makes decisions quickly. She's rarely wrong. He was quiet for a moment, looking at me with that measuring attention that I still hadn't learned how to hold comfortably. Are you all right? The question landed somewhere undefended. Simple and direct and entirely unexpected from a man I'd spent 6 weeks cataloging as unreachable. I don't know how to answer that honestly in the middle of a party, I said. Then answer it dishonestly. I'm fine, I said, and the words came out differently than usual. Lighter, tilted, almost a joke. Because we both knew what I'd said in his office. I'm fine as a deflection. I'm fine as a wall. And now he was asking me to use it knowingly, as a placeholder. And somehow that made it feel like a small and strange intimacy rather than a lie. The edge of his mouth moved. There it was again. That almost smile that I was learning to look for. The one that arrived and left before anyone could be certain it had happened. Come, he said. There's someone I want you to meet. He didn't offer his arm. He didn't need to. He simply began to walk, and I fell into step beside him, and we moved through the room together. And this time when the crowd reorganized itself around him, I didn't feel like something being carried in his wake. I felt for the first time like I was part of the gravity. Later, in the car home, the city unwound itself outside the windows, and neither of us spoke for several minutes. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the library silence. The one that had grown in those morning hours. The one that had texture and warmth rather than distance. Yuna said you've never brought anyone here before, I said. Not an accusation. Just placing the information between us to see what he'd do with it. He was quiet for a moment. No. Why this year? He looked out his window. The lights of the bridge moved over us, rhythmic and pale. Because this year was different, he said. I waited for more. It didn't come. But he'd said it, plainly, without deflection. And something in the quality of the silence after told me it had cost him something small to say it. That it was as close as he came, maybe, to admitting that the ground beneath this arrangement had started to feel different to him, too. I looked out my own window, watched the water of the river below the bridge, dark and moving, carrying the lights of the city on its surface. I thought, 6 weeks ago, I didn't cry at my wedding. I thought, I don't know what I would do today. I found the second letter by accident. Not a letter written to me, a letter written about me. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't going through his things or searching for evidence of anything. I'd gone into the library earlier than usual that Wednesday morning, before Jisoo had come with coffee, before the house had fully woken into its daily rhythm, and the desk in the corner where Gunwoo sometimes worked had a folder sitting open on it that shouldn't have been open. Papers fanned slightly sideways, like someone had been reading and left in a hurry. I would have walked past it. I genuinely would have. Except my name was on the top page. I stood there for a moment, the distance between me and that desk feeling like a decision rather than a measurement. Then I crossed it and looked down and read what was there. And the library, warm and quiet and slowly becoming mine, went very cold around me. It was a report. Formal, clean, typed in the kind of language that strips everything human out of a situation and leaves only facts arranged in rows. My name, my mother's name, my uncle's name, the debt, itemized, and beneath that, a section I hadn't known existed, an assessment, a record of observations from the weeks since the marriage, times I'd moved through the house, rooms I'd entered, conversations I'd had. The call with Camille, logged. The visit to his office, logged. The mornings in the library. Subject appears to have established a routine. No concerning behavior observed. Emotional state. Stabilizing. Logged. Observed. Assessed. Filed. I stepped back from the desk. My hands were cold. My face felt stiff, like the muscles had locked up around an expression I hadn't chosen. I looked at those pages, at my life in this house reduced to entries in someone's security report, and felt something I hadn't felt since the night before the wedding. Completely, absolutely alone. I didn't go to breakfast. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed and went through it methodically, the way I'd learned to go through difficult things, not letting the feeling arrive all at once, rationing it, because all at once was too much to stay upright through. I thought about the mornings in the library and understood them differently now. The coffee Jisoo brought without being asked, the question about Camille, the gala, the touch at the small of my back, the ride home and the bridge lights, and because this year was different. All of it observed, all of it tracked. And then I thought, but he'd read the first letter before it reached me, and he'd still made the call that let Camille through. He'd been watching me for weeks through these reports, and he'd still come to the library every morning. He'd brought me to the gala when he didn't have to. I sat with the contradiction for a long time. It didn't resolve. Contradictions rarely do, cleanly. But it shifted. From something that felt like pure betrayal into something more complicated, murkier, less satisfying to hold. The anger was still there. It wasn't going anywhere. But underneath it was the uncomfortable awareness that I'd been building a version of Gunwoo Shin in my mind over these weeks. And that version was neither the cold transaction of the wedding, nor the warmth of the bridge at night, but something more unsettling than either. Something real, incomplete, and difficult, and real. He found me. I don't know if Jisoo reported that I hadn't come down, or if something in the pattern of the morning registered as different, or if it was something else entirely. But around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at my door, not Jisoo's familiar two-tap, and I knew before I answered it. I opened the door and looked at him and didn't say anything. He looked at me. Took in whatever was written on my face, because something was obviously written there. I was too tired and too hollowed out to manage the careful blankness I'd been practicing. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind it did. A recognition. "You went to the library," he said. The folder was open. He was quiet for a moment. He didn't try to explain it away, or question what I'd seen. "Come downstairs," he he said. "I don't want to come downstairs." "Madison." He said my name the way he sometimes did, not commanding, just present, like the word itself was a small claim. "Please." The please was so unexpected that it moved me more than any argument would have. I grabbed the cardigan from the chair by the door and followed him without answering. He took me to a room I hadn't been in before. Not the office, not the library. A smaller room off the main corridor, more private, with 2 chairs angled toward each other and a window that looked onto a narrow side garden. No desk, no security presence visible. He closed the door and stood near the window with his hands in his pockets and looked at the garden instead of me. "The reports are standard," he said. "Everyone in the house is documented. It's a security protocol, not—" "I know what it is," I said. I sat in one of the chairs because standing felt like it required more energy than I had. "I understand why it exists. I'm not angry about the protocol." He looked at me. "I'm angry because I've been trying to figure out what's real," I said. "In this house, between us, any of it. And finding out that every conversation has been logged and assessed, it makes me feel like I can't trust my own read on things. Like everything I thought was changing between us was just data, being collected." The words came out more honest than I'd planned, more exposed. But I was too tired for the alternative. Gunwoo turned from the window. He came and sat in the other chair, not something I'd seen him do in small spaces, make himself level with someone, reduce the physical distance between standing and seated. He sat, and he looked at me directly, and he said, "It was not just data. How do I know that?" "You don't," he said. "Not from a report. Not from a folder left open on a desk." He paused. "You know it the same way I do. You read the room. You've been reading it since the first morning you came into the library." I looked at him. His face, up close in the gray morning light of that small room, was younger than he usually seemed. Or not younger, more unguarded. Something had been set down. "I chose you," he said quietly. "Yes, because of the debt, because of what your family owed mine. That was the beginning of it, and I won't pretend it wasn't." His jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the effort of precision. But I have wanted to end arrangements before when they stopped being useful. I have never extended them because I looked forward to a woman reading in my library in the morning. The room was very quiet. "You look forward to it," I said. Not quite a question. "Every morning," he said, simply, like admitting it was no longer complicated. I didn't know what to do with that kind of honesty from a man like him. I hadn't prepared for it. I'd prepared for distance, for transaction, for the cold and manageable clarity of an arrangement that stayed an arrangement. I hadn't prepared for him sitting across from me in an ordinary chair in an ordinary room saying every morning like it was just a fact he'd decided to stop withholding. "The security reports will be restructured," he said. "Personal interactions will not be logged." "You don't have to do that." "I know." He looked at me steadily. "I'm doing it because it matters to you, not because it's operationally necessary." I looked down at my hands in my lap, thought about the gala, the touch at my back, the bridge, the almost smile I'd been cataloging like evidence of something I wasn't ready to name. "Gunwoo," I said, and using his name directly felt like stepping onto ice, testing it, committing my weight one careful degree at a time. "What do you want this to be?" The question sat between us. I watched him consider it, not deflecting, not redirecting, actually considering. The quality of his thinking was visible in his face when he allowed it to be, which was rare. I was learning to recognize the difference between the controlled public surface and these unguarded margins. "More than it is," he said finally, "if you're willing." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was an opening, offered without performance, without the vocabulary of romance or manipulation. Just a door, held ajar by a man who didn't open doors easily, waiting to see if I'd walk through it. That afternoon, he took me somewhere unexpected. Not a restaurant, not another event. He appeared at my door around 3 and said there was something he wanted to show me, and we drove 20 minutes north to a small nursery in Riverdale, the kind of place that smelled of damp earth and growing things, with narrow gravel paths between long greenhouse rows. He didn't explain why we were there. He walked beside me through the rows of plants, and a woman who worked there greeted him with the same careful deference everyone showed him, and he pointed at things occasionally and asked her questions I couldn't fully follow. At some point I realized he was choosing things. Plants for the back garden. He had opinions about it, specific ones, thoughtful ones, and watching him stand in a greenhouse debating the merits of 2 different varieties of climbing jasmine was so profoundly normal that I felt something release in my chest. "You garden?" I asked. "I don't have time to garden," he said. "I have someone who does it, but I like to choose what grows. That's still gardening." He glanced at me sideways. "Technically. Definitively," I said. He looked at me for a moment, and the almost smile arrived. And this time, it didn't leave as quickly as usual. It stayed for a full breath. 2. Long enough that I saw it completely, and it changed his face entirely, and I understood with sudden and inconvenient clarity that I was in a great deal of trouble. Not the frightening kind, the other kind. The kind you walk into with your eyes open, because stopping has stopped feeling like an option. On the drive home, with jasmine and something called star clematis arranged in the back, he rested his hand on the seat between us. Just rested it there. And after a moment, after I'd spent that moment talking myself out of it, and then through it, I put my hand next to his, not holding, just adjacent, just present. He didn't move. Neither did I. The city came back around us, loud and indifferent and completely unaware. The jasmine went in on a Friday. I watched from the kitchen window while the gardener worked the soil in the back corner of the garden. And there was something quietly significant about it. Watching something chosen, something living, being planted in ground that had always seemed purely ornamental to me. Like the garden had been a backdrop before, and was only now becoming a place where things were meant to grow. Gunwoo stood beside me at the window for a few minutes before his phone pulled him away. He didn't say anything while he stood there. He didn't need to. We'd been building a language like that. Parallel silences, proximate stillness, the kind of communication that happens in the space between words when 2 people have stopped pretending they aren't paying attention to each other. 3 days had passed since the small room, the honest conversation, the greenhouse. 3 days that felt different from the 6 weeks before them, the way spring feels different from winter. Not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable once you notice it. The air in the house had changed. Or maybe my relationship to it had changed, which amounts to the same thing in the end. It was Jisoo who told me something was wrong. She came to find me Saturday morning with her face arranged into its usual careful neutrality. But something underneath was different. A tightness around her eyes, a precision to her movements that read as controlled urgency. She said Gunwoo wanted me to stay in the East Wing for the day, that there were guests arriving, that everything was fine. People who say everything is fine the way Jisoo said it that morning mean the opposite. I stayed in my room for an hour. Then I didn't. I went as far as the second-floor landing, far enough to hear voices below, too far from my room for Jisoo to redirect me easily. 2 men in the entry hall whom I'd never seen. The kind of men who carry their sighs like a message. One of them was speaking, low, clipped, in Korean, and whatever he was saying had the quality of a demand rather than a conversation. Gunwoo's voice came from somewhere out of my sightline. Quiet. Absolutely controlled. And then a third voice said my name. My actual name. Madison. Said by someone who knew it. Said with a familiarity that had no right to exist in that entryway. I came down 3 more steps before I caught myself. The man who had said my name was looking up at me from the hall below. He was in his 50s, compact, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now was just watchful. He smiled when he saw me, and the smile was worse than no smile at all. "There she is," he said, in English pleasantly. "Your uncle sends his regards." The name your uncle landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. The impact small at first, and then the ring spreading, and spreading, and spreading. My uncle, the man who had taken money from the Shin organization and disappeared. The reason I was standing in this house. The reason I was Gunwoo's wife. I came down the rest of the stairs because stopping on them felt worse than continuing. And when I reached the bottom, I stood very still and looked at this man who knew my name and felt the particular cold of a situation clarifying around you faster than you can process it. "You're not welcome here," Gunwoo said. He hadn't moved. He was standing 6 feet from me, positioned, I registered this only later, between me and the 2 large men without making it look deliberate. "I'm just a messenger," the man said, spreading his hands. "Your uncle wants Madison to know that he's aware of the situation. That family remembers family." He looked at me with that pleasant, terrible smile. He thought she might like options. "She doesn't need options," Gunwoo said. "She might feel differently." The man's eyes stayed on me. "Your mother made this deal without consulting you. Your uncle thinks that's worth reconsidering. There are people who can help you leave quietly. No consequences." The room was very still. I looked at this messenger and I thought about my mother handing me to this arrangement with both hands. I thought about the wedding and 11 minutes and a ring I slid onto my own finger. I thought about the report in the folder and Camille's letter with the crossed-out words, and a greenhouse in Riverdale, and 2 hands resting on a car seat not quite touching. I thought about what options actually meant when offered by a man sent by someone who had caused all of this in the first place. "Tell my uncle," I said, and my voice came out clear and level in a way that surprised even me, "that I don't need his help." The messenger's smile didn't waver. He looked at me for a moment, then at Gunwoo, then back at me, as if recalculating something. Then he nodded, once, with the air of a man who has delivered his message and considers himself done, and left. The front door closed. The silence that followed had a different weight than any silence I'd felt in that house before. Heavier. Relieved. I became aware that my hands were shaking slightly and pressed them flat against my thighs. Gunwoo turned to me. He looked at me the way he had at the bottom of the staircase on the night of the gala. Fully, completely, without the sideways care of someone managing distance. But this was different from that look. That had been recognition. This was something I didn't have a word for yet. Something that lived past recognition, in the territory where you stop cataloging and simply feel. "Madison," he said. "I'm all right," I said. "I know." He crossed the space between us and stood close enough that I had to tilt my face up slightly to hold his eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. "I wanted to." His hand came up, slow, deliberate, giving me every opportunity to step back, and he tucked a strand of hair back from my face. Just that. His thumb rested briefly against my cheekbone, and then he let his hand drop, but the touch remained in the air between us, the way the almost smile remained after it left his face. That evening he told me about his brother. We were in the library. Where else? Sitting not at opposite ends of the room but close, the way the room had rearranged itself over weeks of shared mornings, until proximity was simply the default. He talked quietly, and I listened without interrupting, and he told me that his brother had been the one to make the deal with my uncle years ago, that his brother had trusted someone he shouldn't have, and that the loss, not just financial, but the breach, the humiliation, the consequence inside an organization where trust is architecture, had broken something that couldn't be repaired, that his brother was gone now. 3 years. I wanted someone to pay for it, he said. Not with anger, with the flat honesty of a man describing something he has already examined from every angle. That's the truth of it. I wanted your family's name attached to mine as an acknowledgement, a visible debt. And now? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the garden was dark, and somewhere in the corner where the jasmine had gone in 3 days ago, something was beginning, invisibly, to take root. Now I think about what I almost made you into, he said. A symbol, a transaction, something to resolve a feeling I had about a wound. He looked at me. You are none of those things. What am I? I asked. I hadn't planned to ask it. It arrived before I could decide whether I was ready for the answer. He held my gaze steadily. The person I look for first when I enter a room, he said. The reason I come to the library in the morning. The woman who stood in my entry hall and told a man sent by her own family that she didn't need rescuing. He paused. Mine, if you choose it. Not a transaction, not a claim, a question, dressed in the language of certainty because that was the only language he had, but unmistakably a question. Offered by a man who had built his entire life around never being uncertain, and who was choosing right now to be uncertain. To wait. I thought about the day my mother told me what was happening, and how the floor had felt like it had shifted beneath me and hadn't shifted back. I thought about 11 minutes and a ring on my own finger, and a car ride through streets I didn't know. I thought about everything those weeks had held, the fear, the anger, the contradictions, the mornings most of all. Yes, I said, quietly, completely. He called my mother the next day. I wasn't in the room, but Jesu told me it had been brief. He told her the debt was cleared. Not renegotiated, not extended, cleared, done. That Madison was his wife, and her family's obligations to the Shin name were finished. That my uncle, should he attempt any further contact, would find the consequences significantly less pleasant than a messenger in a hallway. My mother called me afterward, tearful and confused, as if she couldn't locate the correct emotional response to being handed something she hadn't asked for. Are you all right? She kept saying. Madison, are you... I'm fine, Mom, I said. And then, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I meant it completely. The jasmine bloomed 6 weeks later. Small white flowers, almost modest, climbing the iron trellis in the back corner of the garden. I found them on a Sunday morning when I'd gone out with coffee, standing in the cool air and bare feet on the patio stones, and I stood there looking at them for a long time. Gunwoo came out behind me. I heard the door, felt him stop beside me, felt the warmth of him in the cool morning, the way you feel a fire before you turn toward it. He looked at the jasmine. I looked at the jasmine. You were right, I said. About that one. I nodded at the trellis. It's better than the other variety. He looked at me sideways. The almost smile arrived, and this time, as it had been doing more frequently, as it had been doing since the small room and the honest conversation, it didn't disappear. It stayed. It became something complete. He took the coffee cup from my hand, set it on the patio table, and when he turned back he was close, and I was looking up at him, and the morning was very still and very bright, and the jasmine was climbing its trellis like it had always known where it was going. He kissed me like a decision that had already been made. Certain, unhurried. The kind of kiss that doesn't need to prove anything because it already knows it's true. And I kissed him back. Because the ground beneath me had stopped shifting somewhere along the way, somewhere between crossed-out words and greenhouse rows and a bridge at night, and had become, without my fully noticing, something I trusted to hold. We stayed in the garden until the coffee went cold. Neither of us minded.